All right, good evening. It is June already, can you believe it? And this is the Education Committee meeting. With me we have the full committee here, and a number of board members are here also. Today we have two presentations and a number of recommendations. So let's look at any announcements or communications, Dr. Yanni?
There are none this evening.
Okay. Actually, I do want to make one comment. Last week was the induction celebration of the here at the high school of all teachers who were first-year teachers here at Upper Dublin. And it might be they may be first-year teachers in general, or have served in that capacity in other locations. And I just want the community to know that the presentations were really, really impressive of these teachers. And I think it was very inspiring, and the community and our students are very lucky to have the benefit of these teachers. And I want to thank the teachers and their mentors very much for all they did this year to be such enthusiastic and strong teachers. I think that's where I want to leave that. Members of the committee, did you look at the minutes to see if there's anything that you want to mention? No? Art? No? All right, then we'll put those, add those to the list of information items for the legislative meeting. And that gets us then to the first presentation on special education, the plan update for the district, and Dr. Yanni, I believe, is presenting.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Sherpier. So every 3 years, school districts are required by the Pennsylvania Department of Education to complete a special education plan and to submit it to the Department of Education for approval. The plan is largely a compliance document. So it focuses on things like number of teachers, our continuum of services, where we're educating students physically in our buildings and in alternate placements. So as we go through the update tonight, you'll see all of the things that are in the plan. The plan will go up on our website tomorrow or on Friday, and we will ask the board for authorization to submit it to the Department of Education at our June meeting. I want to start again by what I've said here. So the special ed plan is largely a compliance document. So when we talk about a compliance document, we're not talking about goals, we're not talking about action steps. What we are talking about is the current reality and what we need to have. And in talking with Dr. Cheryl Blankman, our new Director of Student Services, I feel pretty confident that as we go through next school year, she'll be working with groups of teachers, some parents, guardians, and families to build out a more robust strategic plan around special education services. The slide, the purpose slide really is just for context when we put this presentation up on the website. It just reiterates my preliminary commentary that we're required to do a plan every 3 years. And we're required not only to report how we're educating students inside our district, but we're required to report if we have students placed out of the district on IEPs or on educational agreements, FAPE agreements, free and appropriate public education agreements. The plan begins by looking at some of our demographic information. As is the case with other plans that we need to complete for the Department of Education, they select a date that we have to pull enrollment from and use those numbers out of our PIMS, out of our information management system. We have 696 total special education students receiving special education services. And when the report was pulled, our total student enrollment stood at 4,076 students. Approximately 17.1% of our students receive special education, and statewide, the average is 18.3%. We have seen an increase in our percentage of students receiving special education, just like the majority of districts in the state have seen that. Keep in mind that when we talk about this percentage of students receiving special education, this is everything from speech only all the way up to placement out of district in an approved private school. So this is all of our students receiving services in total. When you look at how we educate those students, of the 696, 95%, or 663 of those students that receive services receive those services here in our schools, with only 10 out of district placements, and 23 on educational agreements. While we don't have statewide data to compare how we look compared to other districts for those numbers, I did ask Mrs. Penner to speak just a little bit about these numbers in general, and I think she's going to highlight some of the changes that have taken place over the last maybe 5 or 6 years.
Sure. So as we look at the students we've been bringing back, we've added a multiple disabilities classroom at Jarretttown. We continue to increase the supports between the social workers. We have our in-house BCBAs to support some of our students with more complex needs. We have some really great speech and language pathologists who have been continuing their own professional learning and functioning as augmentative communication experts so that we can still collaborate with the IU, but build capacity within our own staff. So some of our most needy students are really able to get what they need inside our schools. So we're proud of bringing back students, not just for the sake of bringing them back. You'll hear some districts just opening rooms and bringing everyone back, but I think the way we've done it's been intentional, and we've been able to meet the needs of those students. Like Dr. Yanni said, we are up a lot of students since 5 or 6 years ago, but still lower than the state average. I think a point of pride is that we continue to be above and trending upwards in the percentage of time kids are 80% or more within the general education classroom. So right now we're close to 70%. So even though we might have gone up 150, 100 to 200 kids, the percentage of kids still accessing general ed curriculum within the general ed classroom is still hovering a little bit above 70%. So we're excited. I think that was right before this PIMS data, but right around there, 69, 70%. You'll hear us talk a lot when we talk about blended learning and universal design for learning that we're teaching kids, not programs. And I think that speaks to why these students are able to have their needs met in the classroom. So they don't have to be at the same pace and at the same speed and on the same lesson as their peers to stay in that room. They don't have to go down the hall if they need extra. They don't need to go down the hall if they need, gifted. We're able to meet a lot more of their needs and still specialize for those students who need it with more intensive support.
We are required to provide a continuum of services. I am going to pass the microphone back over to Ms. Penner, but here's the statistic that she mentioned just a few minutes ago. Just about 70% of our students spend at least 80% of their time in regular education with supports and services. I really want to commend our teachers. Our teachers are continuing to build their capacity to co-teach and to teach in supported rooms so that when students receive specially designed instruction or other supports, we're able to do that in the student's least restrictive environment in general education, because we know that the minute we remove a student from core curriculum, we create a gap. And the longer that students are on a parallel curriculum or an alternative curriculum, that gap widens. So while we're really intentional and we only remove kids from core curriculum when we need to, we've been really working hard to create on-ramps so that as students improve their skills, they're able to get back onto core curriculum with the requisite support that they need.
I think 2 things I'll add is just that The Fontes and Pinnell framework that we have K to 5 right now has been a great support for our learning support teachers in each of the 4 elementary schools. So even if a student is off core, they're still using that same instructional program. So they're hearing the same kinds of stories, they're hearing the same kinds of questions be asked, they're hearing the same access to higher level vocabulary and fiction and nonfiction text, and being challenged in the same way, but at an instructional level that they can independently read. So I think we're excited that that framework has allowed both the learning support and the general education teachers that natural bridge back. We're really excited as we transition 8th grade to 9th grade and really look at the supports at the high school with the new schedule to really think differently about how students receive those supports. So whether it's reading specialists or learning support teachers, working during office hours, working as supports to our content area teachers, not having to do it in a different room with kids taking a different course, but really functioning in a more inclusive way to support the same needs, just in a different way.
A key element of this plan is we have to articulate what supports we have for students that are receiving special education services. And as you take a look here, of course, we have special education teachers and educational assistants. But if you look at the remainder of those positions that are up there, our school counselors, for example, don't only work with students that are receiving special education services. Obviously, they support all students. Many of these employees are our own employees, so we currently have 41, we will have 43 special education teachers next year, and we did that audit with the MCIU, and we feel very comfortable with that staffing level. In a needs-based staffing level, being able to staff for the students that we have currently receiving services, the students that are being evaluated at this time, and students that we expect to be evaluated over the next year. We feel very, very comfortable that we'll be well-staffed next year for special education services. Educational assistance, one of the things that we're going to focus on next year is for students that receive supports from educational assistants, working on a FADE plan so that when the data shows that we can start to fade some of that support, we'll fade and assess students to see if they continue to need that support. Obviously, if students continue to need the support, that's a need, so we won't take a needed support away from kids, but we also don't want students to become dependent on an educational assistant. We have 5 school psychologists. I think our district is incredibly lucky to have 2 of our own employees as behavior specialists. I think I've worked with a lot of behavior specialists over the years. I think our 2 behavior specialists are top-notch, as are the other specialists that we have, particularly in hard-to-staff areas like vision and hearing. OT and PT, also very good. And one of the things that impresses me about this group of employees the most, if you think of speech and language. So when I was in kindergarten, I had a stuttering problem and I couldn't pronounce R's. So I went to speech and I looked in a mirror and the speech clinician showed me how to form my mouth. What speech therapists do now is so much more broad because they're really working on expressive and receptive language with our students. They're helping our students, many of our nonverbal students, find their voice for the first time. And their work is really powerful. And of course, we contract out with Lakeside social workers and counselors, one at the middle school, one at the high school, and this evening, and one at the elementary as well. And this evening, we'll review a motion to continue that level of support moving next year. So one of the reasons we did an outside audit with all of our services is we wanted to get a good look from an objective point of view as to whether or not we were staffed appropriately. And again, I'll reiterate that I think we all feel very confident that we're staffed well for next year. In the plan, there are a number of areas that districts can be cited for. In the past, the district has been cited for disproportionality in over-identification of African-American students for other health impairment and for specific learning disabilities. We've also been cited in the past for disproportionate discipline for Black and African-American students. As we did this plan, with the data that we were provided from PDE, we don't have any citations this time, so we've corrected the issues that we've had. I think that speaks to the efficacy of our detracking work, speaks to the efficacy of the blended learning work that we're doing. I think it speaks to the efficacy of our pre-referral process, where we're really making sure that kids are getting interventions when they need them instead of waiting for kids to struggle and fail. As we move forward, there are 3 critical focus areas for our district. Timely initial evaluations. There have been a number of conversations across the state with Pool Council for Special Education about the inability for many districts to complete all of the evaluations in a timely way. As you might expect, coming back from the pandemic, most districts, Upper Dublin included, received many more parent requests or parent guardian requests for testing. So we are rectifying any of the issues we have there with getting evaluations done. Parent involvement is going to be one of Dr. Blankman's huge focus areas. It's been a little bit of a challenge the last 2 years as we navigated the pandemic. But I know Dr. Blankman, what spoke to us, particularly in her last interviews, was the way that she spoke about engaging parents in their students' education and the services they receive, specifically making sure that parents are providing input on what they see in terms of the efficacy of the services their kids are getting. And then post-school outcomes. So we have a transition coordinator, we do job-based training, we do skills training, but we really want to make sure that we are expanding our footprint with job sites so that as students matriculate to the high school, we have many, many opportunities for them to go out and learn skills so that they are employable after they're done with 12th grade or when they age out of our program at age 21. There are a number of areas that we need to continue to focus our professional learning for staff. Learning how to serve students that are on the autism spectrum continues to be a needed focus area. Autism is such a catch-all phrase anymore. We need to continue building our capacity as to how we truly meet the needs of kids at all levels when they are diagnosed with autism. Positive behavior support, transition, science of literacy. Across the state right now, we're hearing science of reading. Somewhere along the line, someone realized that you have to teach phonics. Kids don't just pick up words by reading lots of books. So the science of literacy, making sure that kids develop proficiency not only in reading but writing as well. IEP development, and then de-escalation techniques for when students are having issues and they're heightened and they need to be appropriately just de-escalated. On the support for employees side, this is one of the areas where I split from PDE a little bit because yes, they talk about all of those topic areas, but they say all of those things have to happen for all teachers, and there's not anything that's specific for special education teachers other than IEP development. Support for our paraprofessionals. Our paraprofessionals do a lot of work with our students in implementing IEPs, and so making sure that we are training them and giving them the capacity to meet the needs of kids, and then really bringing parents and guardians much more into the fold so that they understand really what's in their student's IEP, and more than that, that they know exactly what's happening during the day for their kids. And the last two slides are a series of affirmations that we have to check off for the state. So we have to affirm for the state that we have a full range of services. We have a range of services. When there are students that we cannot program for, then we look for alternate placements or we look for FAPE agreements. But remember, over 95% of our students that receive special education services are receiving those services here in our district. We have to have a child find process. Child find is making sure that particularly our kids that are not school age yet have access to early intervention services, and that's something that in Pennsylvania our intermediate units help us with. We have policies that assure that students with disabilities are included in general ed. The piece that needs to be a big focus area moving forward are extracurriculars and non-academic programs. As we talk about equity, opportunity, and access, we need to make sure that our students that are receiving special education services, even if they have limited mobility or limited cognition, we have to make sure that they have access and opportunity to extracurriculars just as any of their peers would have. We have to say that we will comply with everything coming out of the Bureau of Special Education, that we meet the federal guidelines, and that we affirm that we will follow all of the state guidelines. I feel very confident, having worked on this plan. Mrs. Ionetti reviewed the plan. Ms. Mo Schmidt was the regular education teacher that reviewed the plan. Dr. Clark, I believe, is here, one of our community members. She's a parent who reviewed the plan, a number of our teachers and administrators. So I feel very confident that our plan is well developed for what it is, really a compliance document. And I look forward to seeing what Dr. Blankman will do next year as she engages the SPEAK community and others to really bring families into the fold.
All right, thank you, Dr. Yanni and Ms. Penner for your information. Anybody on the committee have any questions? Yeah, Ms. Ionetti, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the presentation, and I really appreciate that you're going to work with parents. Like you, even though you didn't have to, you pulled that out as where a place we need to put some work, because I do feel that parents are subject matter experts on their kids, and so they have a lot to add to that IEP process. Can you speak a little bit about what the state, does the state, to get, for a student to be eligible, so I think like for speech, students are tested in 3rd grade. How much is that set by the state, and how much wiggle room does the district have?
So the state requires that we have a universal screener for speech. Our district, many of our peer districts, we set that at 3rd grade. The reason we do that is because most of the RTIC issues, the articulation issues, will have corrected themselves with students' age by then, so we get a more narrow focus. I foresee that staying in 3rd grade, but what I will mention is some of our related service providers next year, they're looking universally and seeing what all kids need, and at the beginning of the year, particularly in kindergarten, doing some whole group speech work, whole group OT work, PT work, so that we're not waiting for students to fail, and that we're providing that really good core instruction up front.
So for other types of special education, that eligibility, is that how it's set? Is it mostly set by peer districts? Is it state? Does the state say the child meets?
So when we evaluate students to see if they need specially designed instruction, we look to see if there's a discrepancy between their IQ and what they're able to produce. And if there is a discrepancy, so let's say IQ is of normal range, or typical range, average range, but work product and assessment scores are below that, that's where specially designed instruction comes into play, because there's a discrepancy between how they should be performing and how they are performing.
And so that's mostly done at the school district level? Like we
Yes.
decide? Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And then my last question here is, as we move forward, what will you do to make sure that these things that you want to happen are happening, that parents and students are seeing these things come to fruition?
You know, we talk about choice and voice for kids. I think really what we need to be doing is asking students annually, as their IEP date comes up, what modifications that are they actually accessing? What is it that they need to be successful? And then also asking the parents and guardians as well. Because I think often what happens, and not just here in Upper Dublin, I've worked in other places, and an accommodation gets put into an IEP in 3rd grade, and it stays in there in 4th grade and 5th grade and 6th grade, and sometimes the students don't access it, or sometimes other things are happening that aren't in the IEP. And we really need to make sure that what's happening in the classroom is reflected in the IEP and vice versa, right? So if we're talking about modifying assessments for students, that doesn't mean an educational assistant comes in and takes the kid down the hallway to do the test. It means that accommodations need to happen in the classroom. And if what's written in the IEP isn't working, and there's evidence to show that it's not working, then we have to go through the revision process to make sure that, again, what we're doing, it matches what we have in the legally binding document. Because ultimately, we want kids to be as successful as possible. And I think sometimes through really good intent, what's happening and what's written aren't always aligned.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions? No? Any other board members? Mr. Sirota?
But just real quickly, I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but Meredith, in the context of talking about inclusion in the regular ed classroom, you mentioned gifted, and I just want to, am I correct that these statistics and the rest of this document, this is about chapter 14, not gifted, right?
Yep, correct.
Okay.
Just talking about service delivery model would be the same, access and opportunity within the general ed and then outside of when necessary.
Right, all right, thank you.
Dr. Davis?
Yes, I have 2 questions. The first one, it really came to me when Ms. Ionetti was speaking. And I'm wondering what the process is to make sure that regular education teachers understand what is in a child's IEP. Because I know it's easy for, accommodations not to be administered in the classroom because the teacher was unaware. So I know it takes a lot of time, but I'm just wondering, what do we do here in Upper Dublin to ensure that all teachers know what's in the IEP?
So first and foremost, all students that interact with a student with IEP have access to the student's IEP. That is reviewed with case managers on an ongoing basis. Because you're right, it's very easy to say, oh, I'm giving this quick quiz. I think the student can do it without the either we knowingly or unknowingly don't give the accommodations and modifications. And when we do that, we breach the document. And so one of the benefits of collaboration time that we've added into the schedule is that our special education teachers are working more closely now than ever with our regular education teachers, looking at how students are performing in general, but then also there is a support and consult to teacher about specific things in a student's IEP that need to occur for the student to be successful.
Another question, you mentioned that our numbers have gone up. And I'm wondering, is there any particular area that has increased, or do you just see this across the board? I know, we hear so much about, the number of kids that are being diagnosed with, ASD. And so is that an area that's increased for us, or are there other areas?
We're definitely seeing an increase in autism spectrum disorder, but we're also seeing an increase in something called OHI, other health impairment. So students with attention issues, students with anxiety, students with obsessive compulsive disorder. And we're starting to see now more than ever students that have multiple identifications, right? So they have anxiety or they have attention deficit. They also have a specific learning disability in reading or math. In terms of specially designed instruction or students that need specially designed instruction that have a specific learning disability, we're seeing not as many students having or presenting presenting as though they have a specific learning disability in reading, because I think we've become better practitioners and better delivers of reading instruction. What we're seeing a little bit more are younger students struggling in math. And so we're taking a hard look at that as we go through a curriculum review and instructional design to make sure that we're meeting all of those issues.
Mr. Kessler.
I just want to follow up on Dr. Davis's question. So you mentioned that teachers have access to the IEPs for students, but do the educational assistants have access to the IEPs for students that they are helping with?
Mrs. Penner, keep me honest on this. So the educational assistants work with the case manager, the special education students, on what needs to be done. What we need to get better at is providing targeted access for educational assistants that are working with students so that they have access in the moment for student documentation, right?
So the teachers will meet with the educational assistants and review the full document, but oftentimes the documents are 20 to 40 pages long with information that's very relevant. But the responsibility of an educational assistant is making sure that those SDI, like Dr. Yanni was saying, the specially designed instruction are happening and they're aware. So the teachers create they call an IEP at a glance or a cheat sheet. And that shouldn't be in lieu of reading the full document for anyone, but it provides that in the moment folder of what were these kids, specially designed instruction again, and, and the really important pieces of a behavior plan. So they do develop those additional documents just to serve in that quick at-a-glance fashion.
And are those at-a-glance IEPs available at each level of the educational process, elementary, middle, and high school?
Mm-hmm. Especially for like a high school teacher that has multiple students in their class with a variety. Often they'll do a checklist. These 8 need extended time, these 6 need repeated directions, and just helps them know. And Mr. Hoffman will say often to teachers, if you do 5 or 6 of those things, naturally, as a teacher, you're checking off the list at the same time. So often these supports and strategies are just best practice.
All right. Yeah, I have a few more questions. Some of them are pretty quick. Just back to the numbers, right? When we are talking about students who are receiving special education, is that IEPs only or 504s, GIEPs? Where's the
It's
IEPs only? Right?
IEPs
Yeah,
only,
okay.
yes.
All right. And question I have here is, do we see, ideally, I assume that we want to see kids graduating, sort of getting fewer and fewer accommodations if that is warranted. Are you seeing that? What is the process? Because, not that I want to deny anybody anything, but getting progression with fewer training wheels is probably a good thing.
So one of the things we started age 14 in Pennsylvania is transition services. So there's a section in the IEP called post-secondary transition. It's also when students start being invited to attend their own IEP meetings. And that's something that we really start to have them be advocates for. We go through the list, the teacher will meet with them ahead of time to not put them on the spot at that table, it can be intimidating. But to go through the list of accommodations and really say to them, these are the things that your teachers do for you. which ones, and talk together, not let some of the students decide, I don't need any of that, but have really meaningful conversations with them at the table about what's working, what do you need, what do you maybe need more of, what don't you need anymore. And then we amp those conversations up as they start to age out, because we want to talk to them, and our transition coordinator does a nice job with this of preparing them for things that are things available in college and things that will not be available in college, depending on where they go and what programs they participate in. So we really try to guide them into being more self-advocates at that stage of the game, because in college they'll have to declare themselves.
Also, is there a process to, especially I think at the high school level, where if one teacher finds that something in particular works well, that is being communicated to perhaps other teachers? Because, I mean, if it benefits a student, then why only in one class and not in others?
Yep, so not just at the high school, but those 5th to 6th meetings are really important. The 8 to 9 meetings are really important when you have a whole new staff working with kids. That collaboration time is really big for that. But also we have professional learning time that we dedicate to 5th and 6th grade and 8 to 9 and all of our case managers to say, this is what worked. If you start from ground zero, it's going to be November and you're going to have the same light bulb that we had. Like, don't waste any time. Hit the ground running with what we already know is effective.
So when I see this presentation, and I think what I'm hearing, and I just want to check that really the special education becomes everybody's issue rather than a case manager's issue. Is that a, sort of the overarching message, or am I missing it?
No, you're exactly right. So the case manager is in charge of writing the IEP, but everyone that comes in contact with that student is responsible to deliver what's in that IEP. So that's why we have teaming concepts, that's why we have collaboration time, that's why we're continuing to build these structures in, that we build everybody's capacity to be able to be good deliverers of instruction.
All right, thank you. Anything else? Oh, well, thank you very much. And I'm assuming that we'll see this at the legislative, right? We don't have any, yeah.
So there's no action needed for us to make the plan public, and there's no amount of time that it needs to be public. I clarified with PDE that making it public on Friday, and then, because it's a compliance document only and it's so driven by data from the state, it'll come back to the board for consideration for approval for submission on the 20th.
All right, thank you. And then we are moving right on to the strategic action planning. We already had some presentation on this, but today we have a little bit more, and it's Mr. Hoffman starting us off here.
Yes, thank you. We're just going to dig into goal 2, which we looked at last month with the 3 goals from teaching and learning. If you look at the first slide, this is just a reminder of what the second goal is, and this is really surrounding the district's work with building the capacity of all of our administrators as instructional leaders in our building. So in doing that, I wanted to speak with you all a little bit tonight to talk to you about our work with Dr. Betty Webb. Some of you had the pleasure of meeting her the last time she was here with us. And this is a slide that she often shares with us. And we use this slide when we talk about walkthrough, classroom visits, formal observations, some of the principal coaching that I do with our principals, and even as Ms. Penner and I 2 years ago started talking 3 years ago about the elementary progress reports, it really shifted to this mindset of what is the current state of a situation, what am I on the verge of doing as that next step, and what's that ideal state that we're going for. So when you think about it from a standard perspective, that ideal state is the standard of learning, the standard for an ELA classroom. Where the student currently is and what that very next step is really helping us move all students to that ideal. So we often in our meetings remind each other we can be upset or frustrated about some things, but we have to recognize it's our current state. And we know that we have to recognize where we are and think about what that first step is going to be as we continue to strive for that ideal. So wanted to talk a little bit about where we've been this school year with Dr. Webb. Dr. Webb, when we met her 3 years ago, talked to us a lot about the idea of our proximate customer. And we all want to say it's students, but that's our ultimate customer. Our proximate customer as an executive leadership team is our building principals. Building principals' proximate customer is their teachers. Teachers' proximate customer is their students. So and all of that work is on behalf of students, obviously. But Dr. Webb begins every session reminding us that her goal is to build our capacity and growth and development as instructional leaders so that we can support the growth and development of our principals, so that our principals can support the growth and development of their teachers, so that the teachers can support the growth and development of students. And that's that mindset that, when you think back to that ideal state, that's that step that we each need to take here. So this year, we've collaborated with her maybe 3 or 4 months with 2-day sessions. And those 2-day sessions, we had her here in person with us for 2 of those, and the others were virtual, whole group, some small groups, some one-on-one coaching with executive leadership team, with our building principals. And one of the goals of her work with us is to learn to make our work public and to embed our learning in our day-to-day activities. She constantly reminds us, we've all been to conference or something, and when you come back, you go, oh, that was amazing, but you're back to where you were the day before. And Dr. Webb always reminds us this can't be an event. This has to be what we do. This work is that important. So we've really been working through that as a team, and this year's work really is grounded in that second goal that was on the last 2 slides ago, with an emphasis on supporting principals as instructional leaders. And those 3 bullets there highlight what that work has looked like. We've been identifying and agreeing on high priority practices for principals as instructional leaders. So what are the most impactful things that our instructional leaders, our principals, should be doing on a day-to-day basis? That then leads us to the second bullet, which is removing barriers and creating opportunities that make it possible for them to do those things. Sometimes it's those little things that get in the way of us doing the most impactful things. And we have to look to see what those barriers are. And then coming to a collective agreement on what that system of support looks like. Dr. Webb uses the phrase principals network. And the idea of a principals network is that we have 6 principals plus 5 assistant principals that should serve as a network for each other. When you're having successes or struggles, there's a network to work with you. When you think of that as your core network, then who are the people next who can help? So maybe I have a teacher who is struggling with guided reading. The principal might know that that's a concern. Now, who's outside of that next ring of a network that might help them? And that might be a reading specialist. It might, if it's a reading situation, it might be an instructional support specialist, one of our ISS teachers, if it's really a delivery of that instructional method. It might be our English humanities supervisor who may come in to do some assistance. It might be our special education supervisor who might come in to see how certain students may be facing some barriers. So that agreement of that support is what she's really been pushing us on, that identifying the problem is the first step and then taking it out from there. She often challenges us to make sure that we've identified the right problem first and what questions we need to ask to get there. I won't go through all of these with you. This is up here. But just to highlight, this is a sample draft of what our principals have been working through. So you can see what some of those high priority practices are. Again, I'm not going to read all of the words here, but things like a shared understanding of instructional leadership drives evaluation. So what does it look like with clear areas of focus when we're looking at learning? Establishing measurable goals aligned to the vision and mission of academic success for every student. So how are we measuring that as a building? What I really like about the work with Dr. Webb is that the next step for principals is often what is a building issue, what's a grade level issue, what's a teacher issue, what's a very specific student issue. And that's what these high priority practices would help us get to. Where we're going next with Dr. Webb, we were to have her here in May. And that's one of those, you talk about barriers in hindsight. Scheduling something for the middle of May in a school year was a poor planning on my part. So we do have her coming here live in June, at the end of June, to work with district administration. We're going to be welcoming some of our teacher leaders to that session with us as we talk about making it public, making our work public, bringing them into that work to see. They've seen us visiting classrooms. They've seen us working with. Our principals have been great sharing at faculty meetings and at other sessions with their staff. But to really put our teachers in front of this work with us and learning alongside of us will be great, I think, for our next steps. So the 3 priorities for that future collaboration: additional practice with notice and wondering. So the concept of notice and wondering is when you go into a classroom or a meeting or whatever your situation is, what are the things that you notice and what do you wonder about those things? She works with us, including Dr. Yanni, about, we can't be judgy when we go into a situation. So, if we go into do a walkthrough.
I feel like that was Mr. Hoffman's way of saying I'm judgy, judgy in situations.
You went for it. I was just peripherally. But, we all go into a classroom as educators. I look at the things that are pet peeves to me, if that were my classroom, and we've got to kind of check that at the door and recognize I'm going in to see a very specific area of focus. I want to see what student engagement during independent learning looks like, because I have some indications that that may be a problem, right? So that's really the specific thing that I'm looking at. Then I don't go in to judge it, but I go in to notice what's happening. I notice that students are sitting around a table. I notice that 8 of the 15 of them had a handout in front of them. I noticed that I wonder why 7 of them didn't have that handout in front of them. And so what that starts to do for us, if you remember a few months ago, we talked about the cycle of inquiry. It helps us ask the right questions and get the right information to follow. So that piece is something that we began 3 years ago. It got a little difficult during COVID when we were virtual and such, but I think we're ready to dig back into that. We want to look at trends and patterns in our data, both within schools and across schools, and how that impacts professional learning. And then, as you've already heard me say, we want to bring others into this work. So that's a snapshot of where we've been this year, what we're hoping to do in June over the 2 days, and then I'll answer any questions about our collaboration with Dr. Webb.
Right, are there any questions, comments? Dr. Davis? Or are you just
I was
thinking?
waiting for the committee first, but
Okay.
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, in your work with her, as you're going into classrooms, is there an area of focus that you've been, a curricular area? Have you been focusing more on language arts or math, or like what classes have you really been going into so that you can have some common conversations around this work?
So Ms. Sherpier loved your use of the word noticing, so that was great, Dr. Davis. Noticing and wondering. This year, we've not visited classrooms in our work. We did in our very first year with Dr. Webb. We haven't been in classrooms this year because of it mostly being virtual, except the period that she was here with us. When we have gone into classrooms, Dr. Webb set up meetings and communication with our building principal in advance of those visits to see what the area of focus is to that building that might be specific. What we've done with our work this year has been looking at the data that we have and that we've been getting better at reviewing: EasyCBM data, BAS data, Keystone and PSSA, which is data we're looking at, but also recognizing that we have to look at it differently. We've been looking at that to practice the cycle of inquiry now, and our principals have been going in as a result of that work into classrooms, not with Dr. Webb. So as you would imagine, we've been looking at math for secondary 6 to 12 to see where we are with that from a standards perspective, trying to identify where those areas are and what, again, without judging, where those holes and struggles are. At elementary, I think that we've been focusing a lot on hitting our third grade reading goal and seeing what data we have to support that and student growth. So those were the two areas. I believe when we were at Maple Glen, we looked at math, I do believe, if I remember correctly. But it's been very building specific. She talks about, is it a district issue? Is it within grade bands? Is it within schools? Is it across 2 schools? And so that's one of the things that we look through.
And while we're not doing walkthroughs this year with Dr. Webb, what I can tell you is the efficacy of our walkthroughs has been greatly improved over several years ago. And walkthroughs are no longer a scary part of the Upper Dublin culture. Now it's more or less expected. And if we're not walking through, people are wondering where we are. So I think we've really started to shift. Well, I know we've shifted the culture from evaluation from a moment in time and something that's done to people to really having that become the start of a conversation and build upon goals for the next period of time, whether it's the next year or the next semester. So those conversations have been much more powerful.
Any other questions? Mr. Kessler?
So in one of these bullets about where you've been with Dr. Webb, you talk about removing barriers that make it possible for principals to function as instructional leaders. How do we identify those barriers? What are they, or what were they, and how do we remove them?
So again, I think part of that is very principle specific and context specific. But how we initially started that work was through a calendar audit with Dr. Webb and our principals, where we really looked at what does our calendar look like? What are the buckets that take up the most time? When you do have something on your calendar, are you getting to it? If not, why? And what are those barriers? So we see things like, hallways and lunches and buses and other things. And that doesn't mean that those come off of our plates, but how those function and what they are. Sometimes some of those things turn into, in the moment, whack-a-mole kind of situations, for the lack of a better, phrase. And stepping back, the work that we're doing right now with PBIS, K-12, positive behavior, and really making sure that we have cultures that are not causing us to just keep hitting the small issues each day. So it really started with that individual calendar audit. We also spent some time with our principals. I've been working with our principals one-on-one, doing some longer visits, some walkthroughs to just kind of put a different set of eyes on the building to see what do systems and structures look like, what are responsibilities that administrators are often touching that could be someone else touching that, substitutes, morning substitutes being an example in one of our buildings. Dr. Yanni?
So one of the things we feel pretty passionately about is that we want our principals to spend as much time possible touching instruction that they can. And one of the things that is missing in a lot of districts is this belief that the district office exists to serve buildings. And so we've done things like even streamlining our meeting calendar. So we're not pulling principals out of their buildings multiple times a month for multiple hour meetings. We're creating conditions where we want principals in the driver's seat of instruction in their buildings. So anything that we can do to remove some of the clutter, some of the noise is important to do. I think this year in particular, not making an excuse, but just the contact tracing and dealing with masks and there were so many more of those things that it became exponentially more difficult this year to remove all of that clutter. But as we think about next year and we plan for next year, really getting at the heart of what is taking our principals away from instruction and then deciding who does that work? Or is it just something that we have to live with, right? So as a former elementary principal, I would spend time every morning, I'd get bus write-ups, right? So there was no one else in my building to do bus write-ups, so I had to do bus write-ups. But what I didn't do is I didn't go into the cafeteria. Because if I went into the cafeteria, then I became in charge of the cafeteria, and that then took the middle of my day out for doing observations and whatnot. So we'll be working with each of our principals to continue to remove the clutter and the noise, and that'll be part of the goal-setting process for next year.
Right. I had a couple of questions. It seems to me that, and maybe I'm wrong on this, and there's a couple of principals sitting here in the building, so I may ask you for some input on that too. To the general public, I think the principal is the face of the building to the outside world. So with this emphasis on being an instructional leader, does that really shift your responsibility, the job of being a principal? And are there other pieces that are going off the plate as a result of this? I mean, if you have your focus more on instruction, and by instruction, I think you mean instruction in the widest, broadest sense of the word, not just curriculum, but perhaps, other procedures and well-being. So, where are we going with that?
Dr. Ortiz?
Yeah, I mean, you're here, you might as well speak, right? Yeah.
I'm so glad I was the first one to come up and answer them. So I think it's a great question, and I think that you're right that part of the role that we serve is as the face of the building. But no, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think that what we do in schools, first and foremost, is to educate and to instruct our students. And so if we are truly to be the face of the school and to represent what we do for 8 hours a day for several hundred or several thousand students a day, then we need to have a really close hands-on experience and deep understanding of what's happening in the classroom by being that instructional leader. So I think that one feeds into the other and they both support each other. And I don't think that the emphasis on being the instructional leader takes away from the face of the school or vice versa. I think that some of the examples that Mr. Hoffman and Dr. Yanni gave about some of the other barriers or responsibilities that can fall on principals, I think that that's oftentimes where we can streamline things, but certainly not at the expense of being the instructional leader and the liaison between the building and the community.
Great. And sort of along those sort of lines, what so far, and Mr. Ortiz or Dr. Ortiz or anyone else, your thoughts on that? What so far has been the sort of maybe the aha moment? Is there a particular thing that really has come out of this process already that has impacted your daily activities or your view moving forward?
So I'm not sure if anyone else has different thoughts, but I do think the calendar realignment that Mr. Hoffman mentioned before, while maybe a subtle thing, can be very impactful for us because I think it really streamlines our communication district-wide and within the building. Some of the other aha moments that we've had in those networking meetings that we've had is a need to create and be explicit with the norms and expectations for what are the expectations for us. Thank you. Thank you. What are the shared expectations for us and making sure that all of our stakeholders are aware of that and that we're having explicit conversations so that there isn't confusion with our teaching staff or with our support staff on what should building principals be doing, and not, we want to be clear and explicit with that and every other piece of the organization and who's responsible for what, because I think that that's one thing that we've discussed as a principal team that can really create some efficiencies and consistencies across the board that can sustain time.
Oh, it sounds like PLC for principals, right? PLC, time for principals, is that sort of the networking concept? Oh, I see another volunteer. Thank you so much.
There we go. Thank you. What I wanted to share was, I think, one of the courses that I've taken this year as I'm working towards my doctorate, one of the classes, our professors emphasized to us, in any capacity in education, right, there's three primary things that we're working on, and first and foremost is instructional leadership. Second is being a mediator of conflict. And third is being an allocator of resources. And I think all the work that we do throughout the day, the year, can kind of fall into one of those three things. And what Dr. Webb has taught us, and very consistent with what our leadership team is looking for, is how are we creating conditions, and there's other two things that I spoke of, so that we can get to our instructional leadership. It is what's most important. I think the principal has the unique experience of seeing things in elementary from K to 5. So we know what the mission and vision is instructionally across our building, and that gives us a nice lens. And it's really, really important that we're finding time to be in the classrooms daily, so we do know what's going on in our classrooms, because in the end, the more time we spend, the more we're able to give to our kids, and making sure that everything we are looking for with our teachers is happening in our classrooms. I think that something that Dr. Ortiz said was finding time in our calendar. So looking at our day and saying, this is a time that I am devoting to get into my first grade classrooms. This is a chunk of time that is very, very important that I'm going to get in. And it starts to get into a routine and a habit. And those other things aren't going to go away, but it's how you work with the systems in your building so that your instructional leadership is absolutely the priority. I think that's most important. And then a couple other things that she's really helped us with is just honing our lens, so that, pre-pandemic, we were looking at how are we going in classrooms and collecting data that's objective. We wanted to make sure that we weren't just putting opinions down. And we were learning that and working really hard at that. But what do we do once we have that? So it's identifying, areas of concern, areas of growth, areas of opportunity, and making sure that it's data-based. So when we're making recommendations with our teachers, when we're working alongside them, we have objective data, and then we're able to share that. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for being here. Appreciate that. Any other questions? Oh, yes. Mr. Sirota, go ahead.
Thank you. First, I just want to say I really like the notice and wonder sort of methodology. I mean, I think that's kind of what we do anyway, but to call it out explicitly, I think is valuable. So one of the things I notice here is there's an emphasis on supporting principals and instructional leaders, and I wonder, where did that come from? Was that identified early in the process as an area of growth for Upper Dublin? Did Dr. Webb bring that to us? Did it just start there from the beginning? How did we get to that emphasis?
That emphasis actually started the first year that Dr. Webb was with us. When we took a hard look at how we were functioning, principals had a lot of tasks, and we had a lot of curriculum supervisors. So naturally, the focus of teaching and learning went to supervisors, not necessarily to principals. And we had to shift that dynamic, because ultimately, principals are responsible for teaching and learning in their building and the outcomes for kids in their buildings. So that was something that Mr. Hoffman and I had talked about in a conversation that we had with Dr. Miner when she was here. And that's really, that was something we took into our conversations with Dr. Webb. That's also a focus of hers, so that became the predominant focus. And I will say, we appreciate the board's support of our contract over 2 years with Dr. Webb. It's really, really difficult to find good professional development for an entire leadership team that becomes individualized. So the work that she's done individually with Dave, individually with me and Meredith, I mean, it's literally our entire leadership team getting developed so that we can be the best for the folks that we supervise and evaluate, so that they can be the best for their kids.
Right, well, thank you all, and I think we can move on to the next item on the agenda, which are the reports and recommendations. There are a number, and I'd like to look at A, B, and C. One is a all three are service agreements. They're all renewals. One is for physical therapy, one is for dental services, and one is for physician services. Just wanted to ask if there's any comments from the administration or questions from the board.
So we're continuing to contract with the physical therapists that we've been working with, and we are required by school code to have to engage with a dentist and a doctor. Those folks will be consistent as well, and all the contracts were reviewed by our solicitor.
Great, and I just had one question about the doctor. Was the doctor involved in any of the discussions with respect to the COVID mitigations and?
Anytime we worked on our health and safety plan, we always consulted.
Yes. All right. I think this is something that we need to move on for the legislative meeting. So are members of the committee okay with that? Yes, all right. So the next item is the service agreement with Lakeside. That's a rather extensive one, so I think that warrants a little bit more.
Sure, so there are a couple components to this motion. One of those components are the 3 folks that we contract for extra counseling and social work services, one at the middle school, one at the high school, one at the elementary. One of the reasons that we reserve slots at Lakeside, we don't pay for the slot unless we use it, but we reserve a spot because inevitably what happens is when you need a slot somewhere, you can't get a spot for a student. Lakeside is a therapeutic environment. We're happy with the results we're seeing. There are some other schools in the general area, but it would require kids to be transported long distances. And when students need to take advantage of services that Lakeside or other schools offer, the last thing we want to do is put them on a 45-minute bus or van ride. There are other services in here like in-school counseling, and there's also transportation costs if we have a student or place a student at Lakeside. Typically, we use one of the slots every year. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes it's one slot, but we've been pleased with what we've seen so far.
That sounds good. Any comments, questions? Yeah, Mr. Sirota.
I noticed that the funding for the in-school counseling includes ESSER funds this year. Obviously, it hasn't in the past. Is that because we're increasing the number of social workers or counselors, or is that just a different funding approach for a year or so?
The elementary social worker was 2 years, and that's part of our ESSER plan. So when that ESSER money is gone, we'll be talking about if that service remains, how to put that in our general fund budget. And there are ways that we can do that if that's a service that continues.
Right, okay, thank you.
Good. Are the members of the committee okay, in agreement to move this to the? Yes. All right, then we'll do that. And then there are a number of educational placements. That's item E and F. Oh, no, F is an educational agreement and G is an educational agreement.
All three of those are student-specific, and they have been worked on with internal staff and also reviewed by our solicitor.
Right. Are members of the committee okay to move that on? Yes. All right. Then let's move those on. And that gets us to public participation. We have not received any written questions or comments. And I'm not seeing anybody come up to the microphone. So we'll close public participation. And that leaves me to announce the next meeting, which will be in September 7th. And the meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much for being here.
Mrs. Sherbier, just so everyone knows, always the font of knowledge. Dr. Levinowitz sent me a text that our doctor is an Alumni Hall of Fame inductee. So very impressive. Thank you, Dr. Levinowitz.
He actually is, yes, I didn't know that.